Growing up in the Hollow, or as we called it, the Hollow, was a strange experience. For those who don't know, a hollow is a small valley tucked away in the backwoods, hidden from the eyes of the world. But this wasn't just any hollow. This was a place where stories stretched far beyond the boundaries of time, where secrets nestled in the soil, and where whispers of things best left unspoken carried on the wind. There are traditions here that folks don't talk about things that bind us to the earth, for better or worse. Beneath a few of the older sycamores, there are bodies buried that no one dares to speak of, and some of them aren't human. It's not that we're ignorant folk. We've just learned to live with the strange and unexplainable. Above the double doors of the cow barn hung the remains of a creature that none of us ever fully understood. Its bones were twisted, its skull elongated, with a beak-like snout that didn't look like anything found in the woods. Everyone said it was a buck, maybe a malformed one, but deep down we all knew that wasn't true. My cousins and I used to gather in the yard, staring up at the thing nailed to the barn wall. We'd make up stories about how it got there, about a ravenous beast that once stalked the hollow. But it was my grandfather, a wiry man with a bushy grey beard and a penchant for mason jar whiskey, who fed those stories like gasoline on a fire. Grandad loved to sit by the bonfire at night and tell us kids about the creature. He'd call it the old thing or the hollow beast, spinning tales about how it prowled the rocky slopes, hunting children who wandered too far from home. "You'd best stay close to the fire," he'd say, waving his finger at us, "or the old thing might get you." He always claimed the thing hanging above the barn doors was the very creature from his stories, that he'd killed it himself with his rifle years ago. He'd hold up his hands as if he were aiming down the sights and shout, "Bang!" making the younger kids jump. My dad didn't approve of Grandad's storytelling. He'd tell him he was scaring us half to death, that we were too young to hear such nonsense. But Grandad would just shrug and take another swig of whiskey. I can still see us as kids, sitting around that fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across our faces. We'd huddle closer to the warmth, too afraid to look beyond the circle of light where the shadows danced. Sometimes, when Grandad's stories got especially vivid, I'd lie awake at night, convinced I could hear the hollow beast outside my window. I'd imagine it standing there, its long snout pressed against the glass, its sharp claws scraping softly against the wood as it waited for me to fall asleep. Those nights I'd pull the blanket over my head and pray for the morning. Living in the hollow was like stepping back in time. We had a big family, and between us we filled the small valley along the creek. There were 5 or 6 houses scattered about, each with its own quirks and peeling paint. A 2-story farmhouse with a wrap-around porch stood at the center, the heart of the hollow. That's where I grew up. The creek ran through the middle of the valley, its waters clear and cold, and alongside it stretched the family garden. Calling it a garden felt like a joke. It was more like a small farm, with endless rows of corn, beans, and other vegetables. We kids were expected to help with the planting and harvesting, and by the end of the day, our blue bib overalls would be caked in red clay. Despite the hard work, there was a simplicity to life in the hollow. The pantry was always stocked, and no one ever went hungry. But the creature above the barn doors never stopped haunting us. As I got older, I tried to brush off my fear. It was probably just a buck, like everyone said. Maybe Grandad was just a storyteller, nothing more. But even as a teenager, I couldn't bring myself to look directly at it for too long. There was something about the way it hung there, its empty eye sockets staring out over the yard, that made my stomach twist. I was about 15 when I finally worked up the nerve to ask my dad about the creature. It was during a quiet evening while we were tending to the cows. I gestured toward the barn and asked, "Why don't we just take it down? It's been up there forever." Dad gave me a long look before shaking his head. "That thing's been there since before I was your age," he said. "And as much as I think it's just a deer skull, your granddad swears he killed something real. We'll take it down once he's gone. Until then, leave it be." It wasn't the answer I'd hoped for, but it was enough to keep me quiet. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story. Why did the creature's bones look so human-like? Why did its eye sockets seem to stretch on forever, like they were hiding some kind of void? And why did it feel like it was watching us? My dad always said I had an overactive imagination, that I read too many scary books, but even he didn't like looking at the thing. One afternoon I found Grandad in the barn, standing beneath the creature. The air felt thick, like the weather knew something important was about to happen. He'd taken the thing down from its perch, and he was holding the skull in his hands, studying it like it was an old friend. "Oh," he said when he saw me. "Didn't hear you come in." I froze, unsure of what to say. Seeing the skull up close was surreal. It seemed smaller than I'd imagined, almost fragile, but as I stepped closer I could see the cracks along its snout, the sharp teeth still glistening in the dim light. It didn't feel like a deer skull. It didn't feel like anything that should exist. "What are you doing with it?" I asked. Grandad sighed, his shoulders slumping. "It's time we buried it," he said. "Too many years it's been hanging up there, watching over this place. Or maybe it was the other way around." He looked at me with his milky eyes, and for a moment he seemed older than I'd ever seen him. "You think I'm crazy, don't you?" "No," I lied. He gave a weak smile. "Thank you for humoring an old man." At his feet was a burlap sack, large enough to hold the creature's bones. He crouched down, carefully placing the skull inside before tying the sack shut with a piece of twine. Then he handed it to me. "I need you to bury this," he said, "out at the edge of the woods, somewhere the trees will keep it in the ground." "Why me?" "Because I'm too old, and you're the only one I trust to do it right." I didn't want to take the sack, but I couldn't say no. His hands were shaking as he passed it to me, but when he pulled a bottle of clear liquid from his pocket and took a swig, the trembling stopped. "You're a good kid," he said, patting me on the shoulder. "Now go, and don't tell anyone where you buried it. Tell anyone." I nodded, clutching the sack tightly as I walked toward the woods. The bones inside rattled with every step, a sound that made my skin crawl. The hill leading to the tree line seemed steeper than usual, and by the time I reached the shade of the trees, my heart was pounding. I dropped the sack on the ground and untied the knot, spilling the bones onto the dirt. They didn't look real. They looked like they'd been carved from wood, each one polished to a strange shine. The skull was the worst of all. Its empty eye socket stared back at me, darker than the shadows around us. I held it up to the light, hoping to see something that would make it feel less alive. That's when it bit me. I yelped, dropping the skull as pain shot through my thumb. Blood welled up from a fresh cut, and I stared at it in disbelief. The teeth were sharp, too sharp for something that had been dead for decades. When I looked down, the bones were gone. I stood frozen, staring at the empty patch of ground where the bones had been just moments before. My mind reeled, trying to come up with a rational explanation. Had I imagined it? Had I been so caught up in Grandad's stories that I'd hallucinated the whole thing? But my thumb throbbed with pain, and when I looked down at it, the bite mark was still there, blood trickling in a thin line down my wrist. My body refused to move, locked in a mix of confusion and dread. Then I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, just beyond the tree line, something slipped between the shadows. It was too fast and too faint to make out clearly, a flicker of movement like the distorted figure of a person, but I knew it had been there. My heart began to pound, a drumbeat echoing in my ears as I staggered back. I called out, "Hello?" though I didn't know why. I knew I wouldn't get an answer, at least not one I wanted to hear. The woods felt different now. The usual rustle of leaves and the chirp of birds had vanished, leaving behind a suffocating silence. Even the distant laughter of my cousins playing by the creek seemed muted, like it belonged to another world. I bent down to grab the sack, my fingers trembling as I pulled it tight against my chest. My eyes darted back and forth across the shadows, but the thing I'd glimpsed was gone. The hill was steep and rocky, but I stumbled down it as fast as I could, nearly twisting my ankle in my rush to get away. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something chasing me. But there was nothing, at least. Not that I could see. The thought made my skin crawl. Just because I couldn't see it didn't mean it wasn't there. The sunlight dimmed as a heavy grey cloud passed over the hollow, and the chill in the air deepened. My fingers tightened around the handle of the spade, my makeshift weapon, as I scanned the trees. The feeling of being watched, of something waiting just beyond the edge of my vision, was almost unbearable. I started humming under my breath, a shaky tune meant to drown out my own thoughts, but it didn't help. The quiet pressed in from all sides, and with it came the sense that I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the yard, I was gasping for breath. my legs shaky beneath me. The barn loomed ahead, its weathered wood darkened by the approaching storm. Grandad stood in the doorway, his bony frame silhouetted against the dim interior. He raised a bushy grey eyebrow when he saw me, the half-empty mason jar clutched in one hand. "Well?" he asked. I nodded quickly, not trusting myself to speak. He gave me a long, hard look as if he could see straight through me. For a moment I thought he might say something, but then he just shrugged and turned back toward the barn. I followed him inside, hoping to feel safe within its walls, but the feeling didn't last. The creature's absence from above the door left a gaping void, and the shadows in the corners seemed darker than they should have been. That evening, the hollow was quieter than I'd ever known it to be. The crickets, which usually filled the night air with their incessant song, were silent. The creek, swollen from the recent rains, gurgled softly in the distance, but even that sound seemed muffled, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat on the porch steps with my dad, staring out at the darkening sky. He puffed on his pipe, the faint glow of the tobacco illuminating his face in brief flashes. "Seems like it's going to rain," he muttered, squinting up at the low-hanging clouds. "Why is it so cold?" I asked. He shrugged. "Weather's been strange lately." I wanted to tell him about what had happened in the woods, about the bones and the thing I'd seen slipping between the trees. But every time I opened my mouth to speak, the words caught in my throat. I didn't want him to think I was crazy, and I definitely didn't want him to tell Grandad. Instead, I just nodded and stared out at the yard, the shadows stretching longer with each passing minute. As night fell, the rain returned, pattering softly against the tin roof of the farmhouse. Inside, we gathered around the dining room table for supper. Mom ladled out steaming bowls of stew while Dad and Grandad talked about the crops and the cows. I tried to join in, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the woods. I could still feel the weight of the sack in my hands, the rattle of the bones against my leg, the way the shadows seemed to twist and move when I wasn't looking. After dinner, I retreated to my bedroom on the second floor, hoping to lose myself in a book, but the words on the page blurred together, and my ears strained to catch every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the window. The rain had picked up, hammering against the house in relentless sheets. I glanced at the clock on my nightstand. It was just past midnight. That's when I saw it. From my window, I had a clear view of the yard and the barn. The faint glow of the porch light cast long shadows across the grass, and for a moment, everything seemed still. Then a figure emerged from the darkness. At first, I thought it was a person, a man, maybe moving toward the barn. But as the figure stepped into the light, I realized how wrong I was. It stood on two legs, but its body was too thin, its limbs too long. Its skin was stretched tight over its ribs, the bones pressing against the surface like they were trying to break free. And its face. Its face was nothing more than a hollow skull, the black sockets of its eyes staring up at me. My breath caught in my throat, and I clamped a hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. The creature stood there for what felt like an eternity, its head tilted back as if it could see me through the glass. Then it sniffed the air, its long, snout-like jaw snapping open and closed with a sickening click. I wanted to move, to run, to scream for help, but my body wouldn't obey. Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature turned and vanished into the shadows. The rain masked the sound of its retreat, leaving me alone in the silence of my room. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. It knew I was here. The next few hours passed in a haze of fear and exhaustion. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the window, waiting for the creature to return. But the yard remained empty, the shadows undisturbed. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew there was a loud banging at the front door. I bolted upright, my heart racing. The clock on my nightstand read 4 a.m. Throwing on a pair of boots, I rushed downstairs to find a group of men standing in the doorway. They were neighbors, their faces pale and drawn, their coats dripping with rain. Lanterns swung from their hands, casting eerie shadows across the walls. "What's going on?" Grandad asked, shuffling into the living room with his mason jar in hand. One of the men, a burly farmer named Sam, spoke up. "It's Joe," he said, his voice trembling. "He's gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Dad demanded, stepping forward. Sam shook his head, his eyes darting toward the window. "We heard something break into his room. When we went to check, he wasn't there. There were claw marks on the walls, like some kind of animal. He trailed off, his gaze shifting toward me. Granddad's eyes narrowed, and he turned to me with a look that froze the blood in my veins. "What have you done?" he hissed, his hands trembling as he grabbed my shoulders. "I didn't—" "You were supposed to bury it," he shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "I told you to bury it." Dad stepped between us, pulling Granddad back. "Calm down," he said. "He's just a kid," Granddad sneered, snatching the lantern from Sam's hand. "I told you this would happen. I told you it wasn't over." The men headed out into the storm, their lanterns bobbing in the darkness as they disappeared toward the woods. I stayed behind with Mom, barricading the doors and windows with furniture while the rain pounded against the roof. The screams started just before dawn. The screams pierced through the storm like a blade, sharp and unmistakable. Two voices, human and anguished, rising and falling, their echoes carried through the holler by the pounding rain. Mom dropped the chair she was pushing against the back door and froze, her face going pale. I was still at the kitchen table, my head buried in my hands, but those sounds jolted me upright like a slap to the face. "What's happening?" I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. Mom didn't answer. Her trembling hands gripped the edge of the counter, her knuckles white. She glanced at me briefly, and for the first time in my life, I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before. Terror. Real. Unfiltered. Bone-deep terror. Dad burst through the front door a moment later, soaked to the bone and dragging mud into the house with every step. His face was hard and set, the kind of look he wore when something bad was happening, but he was trying to keep control. In his hands he carried a dripping burlap sack, the same one I had taken to the woods. "It's done," he muttered to Mom, his voice low. "I found the men, took care of it." I blinked at him, confused. What do you mean? Where's Granddad? What about Joe?" Dad's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Instead, he strode past me toward the back door, muttering under his breath. "This isn't over." "Where's Granddad?" I demanded, my voice rising in pitch. He turned and looked at me, his face a mask of exhaustion and sorrow. "Gone," was all he said before opening the door and stepping back into the rain. The hours dragged by in a fog of uncertainty. Mom refused to tell me what had happened in the woods, and Dad didn't return after he left with the sack. I sat by the fire, listening to the rain hammer against the roof, my nerves fraying more with each passing minute. I couldn't shake the image of that thing standing in the yard, its hollow sockets staring up at me. It had taken Joe. That much I knew, and now Granddad was gone too. The worst part was the silence. Not the silence in the house. Mom kept busy in the kitchen, clanging pots and pans together in some futile attempt to distract herself. But the silence outside. Even with the rain, the hollow should have been alive with sound. The creek, the crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl. But there was nothing, just the drumming of water on tin and the faint hum of the wind. When Dad finally returned, the first light of dawn was breaking over the hills. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy and damp. He walked in through the front door, his boots caked in mud, his clothes torn and streaked with grime. He looked older somehow, like the events of the night had stolen years from him. Mom rushed to him, her hands fluttering uselessly around his arms and shoulders. "What happened?" she asked, her voice frantic. "Where were you? Did you—" "It's done," he said, cutting her off. He glanced at me briefly, then gestured for me to follow him. I didn't want to. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to stay inside, to stay safe. But the look in his eyes told me I didn't have a choice. Reluctantly, I pulled on my boots and followed him out into the yard. The world outside was eerily still. The storm had left behind a thick fog that clung to the ground, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The barn loomed in the distance, its doors hanging open, but I couldn't bring myself to look at it for long. We walked in silence, Dad leading the way, his shoulders hunched and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He didn't speak, and I didn't dare break the silence. My heart pounded with every step, the damp air pressing down on me like a weight. Eventually, we reached the edge of the woods. The trees rose like sentinels, their branches dripping with rainwater. Dad stopped and turned to face me, his expression grim. "You're going to help me bury it," he said. I stared at him, my throat dry. "Bury what?" He didn't answer. Instead, he dropped the burlap sack onto the ground with a heavy thud. The sack shifted slightly, as if something inside it had moved, and my stomach turned. "We should have done this a long time ago," Dad muttered, more to himself than to me. He pulled a spade from where it had been strapped to his back and thrust it into my hands. "Dig." I hesitated, my fingers tightening around the wooden handle. "What's in the bag?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Dad didn't respond. He just pointed at the ground. I started digging. The soil was wet and heavy, clinging to the spade with every scoop. My arms ached, and my chest burned with each labored breath, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. Dad stood silently beside me, watching as I worked, his face shadowed and unreadable. When the hole was finally deep enough, he nodded and knelt beside the sack. He untied the twine that held it shut and pulled it open, revealing the contents. It was the bones, the same twisted alien bones I had carried into the woods the day before. The skull sat on top of the pile, its hollow socket staring up at me with an almost accusatory glare. I flinched, taking a step back, but Dad grabbed my arm and pulled me closer. "You need to understand," he said, his voice low and steady. "This isn't just some old animal. It's something older, something that doesn't belong here. Your granddad knew it, and now you know it too. We have to keep it in the ground, no matter what." I nodded, swallowing hard. Together, we lowered the sack into the hole, the bones rattling softly as they settled into place. Dad began shoveling dirt over them, and I followed his lead, trying not to think about the way the skull seemed to be watching me. By the time we finished, the sun was fully up, casting long shadows across the hollow. The fog had begun to lift, but the air still felt heavy, oppressive. Dad patted the mound of freshly turned earth with the flat of his spade and stood back, his face drawn and weary. "Don't tell your mother about this," he said. "She doesn't need to know." I nodded silently, my eyes fixed on the ground. We walked back to the house together, neither of us saying a word. When we reached the porch, Dad stopped and turned to me. "If you ever hear anything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "anything at all, you come get me, understand?" I nodded again, my stomach twisting with unease. Inside, Mom was waiting for us, her face a mask of worry. She didn't ask what we'd been doing, and we didn't offer an explanation. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I tried to go about my usual chores, but my mind kept drifting back to the woods, to the hole we'd dug, to the bones buried beneath the earth. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought I heard something. A faint rustling sound, like leaves brushing against each other in the wind. I sat up, straining to listen, but the sound was gone. I told myself it was nothing, but deep down I knew better. It's been years since that night in the hollow. I don't live there anymore. I left as soon as I was old enough, moving to a city far away from the quiet, haunted hills of my childhood. I don't go back often. Mom and Dad still live there, but we don't talk about what happened. Not about Joe or Granddad or the thing we buried in the woods. Sometimes, though, when I close my eyes, I can still see it. The hollow sockets, the twisted bones, the way it stood in the rain, staring up at me like it knew me. And sometimes, late at night, I hear a rustling sound outside my window. I tell myself it's just the wind, but I never look, because I'm afraid that if I do, I'll see those eyes again, staring back at me from the darkness.